experiences of children, for example, coming from Middle East in Europe and their experiences of migration. Let me share the screen again. So we discussed in the previous session about the criminalization of migrants, especially coming from non-Western background, including Middle East, including those coming from Middle Eastern countries, and the criminalization of migrants as a group. And many scholars criticize these migration policies as based upon false perception of security, and they say, look at the wars we are having today, and you observe the wars happening today as well. And these come from authoritarian rulers, authoritarian institutions, and norms in the country. So immigration is not the first security threat, and this criminalization of immigrants divert away are based upon a false perception of security. And they also say these migration debates that securitize and criminalize immigrants, they lead to the losing of a sense of community, defining immigrants as excluding immigrants from the community. And the EU returns to a state of fundamental exclusion. And the statistics also show that there is structural racism, everyday racism that is lived by migrants on everyday basis. Structural racism means the exclusion of people from institutions, from sectors. For example, the exclusion from housing, from good housing, from labor market, the exclusion from education. These are considered as structural racism. The discrimination from housing, the discrimination from education, the discrimination from labor market, the discrimination from health sectors. These are considered as part of structural racism. And if you look at the statistics, we see the inequalities between immigrants and local populations in Europe too. Immigrants are disadvantaged in terms of access to housing, access to education, access to health. And if you look at the European Union policies, the EU also is encouraging member countries to improve their policies to prevent the structural racism against immigrants. And there's also everyday racism. Everyday racism occurs more on everyday basis and mostly through informal contacts, like staring at someone because it is different, or saying racist slurs, or misrepresentation, criminalization in the discourse. These are parts of everyday racism. And many migrant children and many migrants, immigrants, but also the children and the grandchildren of migrants, they are also still exposed to structural and everyday racism. And scholars also discuss the colonial legacies upon this, like this division between colonizer and colonized, and how this division also shapes the segregation between immigrants and locals in Europe today. And I have assigned an article on the racial stuckness of youth coming from migrant families, and how their experience of racialization and racial exclusion also encouraged them to migrate out of Europe. And this is a very, I think, this is all, I think, a very interesting phenomenon, because we are always discussing the migration through Europe, but we are also seeing some children who are born and raised in European countries, who are maybe second, third, and fourth generation, so they are now proper citizens of the European countries, and but they are choosing to go out of Europe to other global cities. And in this article, they concentrate on migrants coming from North African countries, Maghreb countries, and their experiences. And there was one question about Middle East migrants. Um, the migrants from Middle East, the history dates back also to the colonial legacies. For example, in the example of France, there is not also colonial legacies upon the migration of Middle Eastern migrants, but also, for example, after the Second World War, with the increasing economic development in Europe, there was also the increasing inflow of migrants coming from Middle Eastern countries just to find a work in Europe, because at the time, the Europe was also concluding agreements with many countries in the Middle East and to attract workers, because there was significant economic development in the aftermath of the Second World War. So the migration of people coming from Middle Eastern countries, they speak not only to the colonial times, due to colonization, but also there is significant inflow of migrant laborers coming from Middle Eastern countries in the aftermath of the Second World War, but also the wars that occur in Middle East, like Iraqi-Iranian war, Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Um, they also triggered a significant inflow of refugees coming from Middle Eastern countries to Europe. And now there is second generation youth, even third and fourth generation youth, who are born and raised in the EU, but they came from migrant roots and from the Middle Eastern countries. And in this study that I assigned as an article in the course, the author talks about the youth coming from migrant families, sorry, and coming from North African countries. So these youth, their migrant roots come from African countries, and the authors talk about their experiences of racialization and how one of the main motivation that stimulated them to migrate to other global cities is the racism they lived in Europe. So they feel mm, eh, they don't see Europe as natural home to which they would one day return, and they feel a sense of racial stuckness in Europe, distinctive concerns over racialized status, impediments to social mobility in Europe. And they also talk about their experiences of racism in Europe as a structural feature of European societies. And in this article, the author also discussed how this Europe's migration regime is interwoven with discourses of racialization and coloniality. And in the experience, when you talk to the experiences of many youth coming from migrant backgrounds, you will also see, for example, their experiences of feeling racialized, feeling marked, and constantly being treated as persistently foreign. And this treatment does not also change according to their legal, educational, and economic standing, because in this article, for example, they interview educated youth who finish their university degrees, but despite their educational achievement, despite being born and raised in Europe, they don't feel Europe as their natural home because of the racialization they lived in their everyday life. For example, I put several, they recount their experiences For example, and I put several vignettes from interviewees, and if you read the article, you will see many more example of these racialization experiences. For example, one interviewee say, I made sure to first finish my bachelor's and master degrees before taking the plunge, the immigration. 2 years later, I don't regret this choice whatsoever. When I look at how the economic and political situation is developing in France, it only endorses my earlier decision. I don't return on returning to France, even if my family and friends are still there. I simply don't feel at home any longer in a country where racism has become a banality and where, in order to find a job, you have to change your name on your CV. For example, I also see a research on people's changing their names in Sweden, and there are experimental studies, for example, that are done also in many European countries. And what the researchers do, they do put the same CV, they put a Western name into one CV, and they put a non-Western name into the other CV. But these CVs are the same, so they have all the qualities in the CV are the same, just the names are different, and they sent these CVs to employers, and the results also show the inequalities, the disadvantages, the racism lived by people who come from non-Western backgrounds. So even though you are born and raised and you are second, third, fourth generation race here, we observe there is discrimination, there is racial discrimination, for example, because of your origins, because for example, your name seems non-Western. So employers tend to call people with a Western name more compared to people with a non-Western name. So this, for example, this shows the racial discrimination in the labor market, for example. And another interviewee says, growing up in Belgium, I ended up saying I was Algerian, not because I am nationalist or anything, but simply because I never felt accepted as Belgian. You feel it everywhere, in the metro, at school, in restaurants, at work. At a certain moment, you say, what the hell? That just keeps on going, no matter how many degrees you have. It's like being bullied when you are young. At some point, you expect it to stop. Not in this case, though. It persists, even if it's subtle at times, and it really drives you crazy. But now that I have lived abroad, I do realize that it can be very different elsewhere, better even. So here the study is conducted with educated youth coming from and their families came from North African countries, and they are born and educated in European countries, and they have migrated to United Arab Emirates, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, etc. And they these interviews tell about their experiences of racialization in Europe, and in this now Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, they don't feel this pressure of racialization. So they are now uh, they don't feel this feeling of racial stagnance, this feeling of racialization in everyday life, and they tell about their experiences, how they one of the motivation for them to migrate was this experience of racism. They lived in their home European countries. And another interview says, home is not supposed to be the only place you don't feel welcome. After the racism I faced in Belgium, I realized that I might be an Arab because, after all, I was treated like one. It, United Arab Emirates, felt like home. I knew I wouldn't be judged. And also for the money. I thought that I could help my family financially, which would lift the guilt of leaving them behind in Belgium. It is sad to say that, but I did feel like leaving them behind in a hellhole, Mellenbeek. The United Arab Emirates didn't disappoint me. I was treated like a human being, like a good person, like an architect. So we see in these experiences in this vignette and in how interviewees recount their experiences of racialization in Europe. And even though they are born and raised in European countries, um, they chose to migrate out of Europe. And this is a very interesting phenomenon, in fact, because we always discuss about migration to Europe. But I chose this because it is a very interesting experience of migration out of Europe. They simply choose to migrate because they are fed up with racialization, with the racist exclusion in European countries, for example. And and for the Swedish case, I put recommended reading. You don't have to read it, but if you wonder about it, if you wonder about the anti-Muslim racism, you can have a look at the article. And in the article, the author also discussed about the colonial discourses on Islam and Muslims and their experiences of othering in Sweden. And media portrayals of Muslims and Islam, they revolve around issues such as terrorism and oppression. And there are views about the incompatibility of Islam with the Swedish cultures. And the author also discussed about the previous research upon Muslim children and how they lived racism at the workplace and in the schools. And there is also everyday racism, like Muslims are continuously asked to clarify their stand on values, secularism, homophobia, sexism. So they feel marked in society because of their culture, because of their religion, because of their migrant background. And interrogating Muslim about loyalty toward the country, and this interrogation, these disciplining behaviors increase, especially during the security crisis. And in racism studies, we also these behaviors are called as microaggressions. Huh? These are not directly violent, but interrogated, and but these behaviors are disciplining, interrogating behaviors, and these are called as microaggression against people. And they leave the constant answering up to others about one's religious identity in everyday life, being racialized as Muslim, and especially during the security crisis like 9/11 terrorism case, 2015 European refugee influx, these discourses of treating migrants as perpetual foreigners. These discourses increase and intensify. I also here put for example, I talk about everyday racism, and everyday racism are in fact informal behaviors. So this is not like exclusion from the housing, from the labor market, from the education, but these are informal discourses, stares, marking you. These are also examples of everyday racism. And for example, in this study on anti-Muslim racism in Sweden, also for example, one interviewee talks how staring and we how staring people stares, people look at her, let her leads to feeling being marked in society. For example, sometimes it feels like you are someone and you feel a certain way, but the other person doesn't think of you that way. For example, I went to pick up my son from his football practice. So we were walking through an area which is quite segregated. And I noticed the moment we entered the area, there's a sense of irritation among people sitting there. They look and look like they really stare at you. It is uncomfortable. You are out walking with your family. We are not doing anything that they aren't doing. They are out eating. We are out eating. They are eating ice cream. We are eating ice cream. It's just because of this image. I don't know. I noticed something during the parental leave which I don't think is good for the children. You cannot be hurt too much. Say thank you. Say I am sorry. You become like this. You cannot be seen the children cannot be seen because we can be perceived as wild animals. And sometimes it can be like person may not be thinking like that, but you just think like that automatically. So the interview says basically she feels marked because of the constant stares at her because she is different. So this is an example of everyday racism, for example, these informal discourses, uncomfortable stares. Um, People feel being marked because others think that they feel different, and we also see, for example, this anti-Muslim racism. And the accounts of interviewees, they also tell this as an example of everyday racism, for example. And do you have any other questions? You can put in the Q&A and I can answer them. Do you have any questions about racism and racism lived by people coming from Middle Eastern backgrounds, or any and your experiences maybe regarding this subject? Name-based discrimination, exactly. Exactly. For example, I have seen a study on the tendency of people coming from migrant backgrounds, children of migrants. They also change their names. As I said, for example, especially when they finish university degrees and they want to find a job in line with their backgrounds, their educational levels. Um, Children coming from migrant families, they have a tendency to change their names because they don't want to be exposed to racial discrimination in the labor market. Mm. Yes, exactly. This is a study on migrant children coming from North African countries. So their families came from North African countries and they immigrated to Gulf states. But there are also many examples of people coming from North Africa, this kind of children coming from migrant families, and they also emigrate to other global studies, cities like Toronto, New York, even now, like Singapore, for example. There are also many children coming from migrant backgrounds, born and raised in Europe, and they, for example, migrate to Asian cities. There are examples of this, but this study was based on people who migrate to Gulf, Gulf countries. Yeah, I'm gonna upload the PowerPoint presentation after the course onto the plans on Atana, so you will be able to download it. For the any war in Europe, that's like there is war in Europe between Ukraine and Russia. Oh, and with this outbreak of war between Iraq and Iran, the situation in the world is getting more serious. So this, I show you the statistic on forced migration and how I can show it today now. The situation is urgent. The situation is from if you look into the picture from an humanitarian perspective, the situation is very dramatic. And as you see, the forced migration is increasing in the world. And it is not only because of the people escaping war conditions, but also, for example, climate change. And you see, for example, last year with the Los Angeles fires, we saw how, people living in Western countries, they can be also displaced migrants, okay? They can be seeking shelter and refuge. And that's why international human rights organization calling every country to improve um, their conditions for these forced migrants, like asylum applications, shelters, detention, that they should be reorganized in a more human and safe way, because this is not a situation that affects only people in Middle Eastern countries. This is affecting everybody, and the situation is worsening not only because of this emerging outbreaks of war, but also because of the climate crisis. Exists and told me it doesn't. In fact, yeah, anonymous attendees asking very interesting and very good questions. Thank you for this. Have you checked the recent survey at Stockholm University? And I was also like, I think one quarter, but check the survey because I think it is sent to everybody, including teachers and students. You can check the survey. And the survey, I think, was very, um, it raised many concerns. I think the survey was showing like one quarter of students think they lived racial discrimination at the university, and there was almost, I think, 15. It was 15% of students also reported sexual harassment, something like this. So the survey was also like the results of the survey done at Stockholm University also revealed racial discrimination, and there was also, I think, very concerning data about sexual harassment. Thank you for the question. Yes, there is also, even at the universities, there is racial discrimination. Curiosity. Okay. It the interpretation of racism, thank you, Maria, for the question, is changes. Curiosity, yes, because for example, in many cities, if they are not used to living with migrants, foreigners, if they are not used to foreigners, they stare at you. Okay, this is simple curiosity. But for example, in this case, in the anti-Muslim racism, like one quarter of Swedish population comes from foreign backgrounds, and there's an important Muslim population, and there are even third and fourth generation migrant children coming from migrant backgrounds, so born and raised in Sweden. In this case, constantly staring can be considered as racism because the other feels marked. Yes, exactly. Segregation in schools. Thank you, Elim, for the question. Yes, and in fact, a couple of days ago, my son also lived racism because her friends told him they don't want to play with a brune face. So there is racism in schools in Sweden as well, and I also personally experienced it. And segregation between white and non-white students is considered also as part of racism in schools, and in fact, it is very difficult to detect racism, especially in primary schools, in secondary schools, because the researchers have to spend large amount of time to detect racism among students. But yeah, studies also show there is racism in the education system, in schools among children. There is studies, yeah, there are studies in multicultural countries too. In fact, rarely countries are homogeneous and monocultural. Like Japan is considered very homogeneous countries, like 93%, I think, composed of Japanese, but in almost every country there are studies upon racism, and especially in Europe there is really large amount of studies on racism in Europe you can find. It is on Athena. You can find the documents, and I will upload. I didn't upload the PowerPoint presentation that I presented today, but I'm gonna upload it after the course, so you will be able to access it. And I also put the articles that I assigned, and there's a book chapter I assigned, and you can access it through the Stockholm University library system. So you can find all the resources. If you can't find, you can reach me if you have any questions. I'm gonna put my uh, here is my email. If you have any questions, if you are not able to access to the documents, you can write to me. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you everybody for this lively discussion. How come I cannot see why? It is on Athena. If you are able to access the Athena system, okay. It is on Athena. If you can't access to the readings and the PowerPoint, you can write to me and I will send you the documents. But you will find it on Athena. And all the resources I assigned for the course, you can access to these resources through Stockholm University Library. Okay. Thank you everybody for this lively discussion. Thank you for participating. You can, if you have any question, you can write to me. Thank you everybody. Have a great day. Hope to see you more in the campus and hope to discuss more in the campus. See you. Bye bye. Thank you. Thank you everybody.